Welcome, everybody. First of all, this event is brought to you by Studium Generale and the International Office. Studium Generale organizes scientific, social, and cultural programs throughout the year for students and employees, of course, of the Erasmus University. My name is Eddie Alemend. I don't work for Studium Generale. I work for the Faculty of Philosophy, or how we nowadays call it, Erasmus School of Philosophy, and I will be your moderator for tonight. So the question for tonight is, who was Erasmus anyways? Erasmus of Rotterdam. And that is what he called himself. But he wasn't the architect of the Erasmus Bridge, and no, neither was he the founder of the Erasmus University. Well, he might not even have been from Rotterdam. And how did he become such an influential character in our university? So today, a crash course by Professor Hans van Ruler about his still pioneering ideas, his life and work, and his homoerotic letters to a priest. So in this lecture, Hans van Ruler will introduce us to the life and works of Desiderius Erasmus Roterodamus. A crash course on the most important facts and figures about the influential author of books like the Praise of Folly, citizen of the world, and of course an advocate of religious tolerance. And after this lecture, you'll know what to tell people when they ask you the question, who was this Erasmus anyway? So a must for anyone who never wants to get caught out again at family dinners when asked why your employee is called Erasmus. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Professor Hans van Ruler, who is an acclaimed Erasmus expert, professor of intellectual history, and vice dean of Erasmus School of Philosophy at the Erasmus University of Rotterdam. Together with Jeroen Hermkens, he wrote In de voetsporen van Erasmus, in the footsteps of Erasmus. Here he is. A great round of applause, please.
Yes, thank you, Eddie, and a warm welcome to you all, and thank you for coming here despite the beautiful weather outside to learn more about this figure. Well, who is this figure? We know him, or we know his face, because this is the face of Erasmus, and you come across the statue of Erasmus in Rotterdam. And so we have an image of the man himself, Desiderius Erasmus Roterodamus, as Eddie already told us. But we also know, well, sometimes we don't really know very much. We've not known when he was born exactly. Like, it's always been 1466. And I always doubted that, actually. I thought, well, wouldn't it rather be 1469 or thereabouts? And so lots of people have delved into this, and now I'm happy to say that there's a new, for the Dutch readers among you, new biography of Erasmus. I'm sure it's going to be published in English as well, so you can all read it, by Sandra Langerijs, who has actually come to the conclusion that it must be 1469. So I'm very happy that I can now just say, well, it was 1469. I thought so always anyway. We also have a new image of Erasmus because, well, Sandra Langerijs put this, I must just check the name, Neil Korteweg. Yes, Neil Korteweg is the artist who gave us this new, well, imaginative picture of Erasmus as if he was a teenager, like 16-year-old Erasmus, in a sort of flowery shirt, which is actually a very nice way of portraying him, because in Langerijs' book, Erasmus also becomes this dwarsdenker, this sort of, well, I don't know, a bit of a brat, really, within his own times, and a youngster, really, who kicks against all sorts of authorities and then develops himself on the basis of that. The old pictures of Erasmus are still better known. This first picture, for instance, was a picture that Erasmus gave to his friend Thomas More, famous English magistrate and courtier Also, of course, a saint of the Roman Catholic Church later on because of his relations to the King Henry VIII, but that's another story. Erasmus and Thomas More were great friends. And so this particular picture was made by a Flemish artist, Quinten Matthijs, together with a picture of Pieter Gillis, an Antwerp friend of Erasmus and More's, that they gave to Thomas More on the publication of Thomas More's book, Utopia, because they had all cooperated on that particular book. And so Erasmus gets Quinten Matthijs, who was really a famous portraitist, to paint his picture as well as Peter Giles's picture and send them as a triptych, as a diptych, really, to Thomas More. There is much that tells you about their friendship there, but there's also much that tells you about Erasmus getting a, well, not too cheap artist to paint his picture, which he did all the time. I mean, that's the one by Quinten Matthijs. This is the one by Hans Holbein the Younger. This is Lucas Cranach, in this case, the elder. But they're all very, very good artists. And so he knew how to present himself, and that's very typical for Erasmus as well. He presented Erasmus of Rotterdam as a trademark, you could say, as a trademark for himself to become more known to the general public. And that's also what we find in this name, Erasmus of Rotterdam. I mean, Rotterdam, this is where Erasmus was born. Well, it doesn't look much like it now, but Erasmus was born somewhere here, where there's now also a commemorative plaquette in the street. At the time when the Lauwenskerk was actually being built. There was a church there before, but now there was this new church being built towards the end of the 15th century. Long, long, long time ago. And that was where Erasmus was born. Well, was he? People from Gouda say he wasn't, because they say, well, no, he's not from Rotterdam. But of course he was. I mean, Erasmus called himself Desiderius Erasmus Roterodamus. He would have called himself as someone from Gouda if he'd really been from Gouda, wouldn't he? And so Roterodamus is something that he also uses as a trademark because he wants people to know that this is exactly the same guy all of the time. First he is called Erasmus. Then he calls himself Desiderius Erasmus. He just makes this up himself. But then in the end, he decides, no, it's not Erasmus, it's Erasmus, and it should be Desiderius Erasmus Roterodamus. That's my trademark. But then later he thought, that Desiderius, forget about it. Erasmus Roterodamus is my name. And so he chose also for Rotterdam, and that's why he became our local hero, you could say. Local hero because of the bridge, yes. Or local hero because of, I don't know, all the other things that are Erasmian in Rotterdam. There's a print shop, I guess. There's places for getting your driving license. There's a university. So he is really our local hero, we could say. He's not from Gouda because his mother's family lived in Rotterdam, and that's probably where he was born. And that also tells you something about Erasmus himself. The family that he came from his mother's side was a family of doctors. And so what you could say is that, Erasmus wasn't born in poverty. Living close to the church, in their own home, which is where his grandmother lived, isn't a place it's a respectful place to be born. But then at the same time, Erasmus didn't get much respect for himself on the basis of who he was when he was born. Because despite not living in poverty, Erasmus was still an illegitimate child. And that's where Gouda comes in. Because his father was from Gouda, but his father was a priest. His father couldn't have really had any children officially, because he wasn't allowed to. He wasn't even allowed to have sex. But apparently, his father and his mother didn't care too much about that, because Erasmus already had an elder brother. So they just kept on having children, but that would be a problem for Erasmus, because Erasmus later went into, well, theology and wanted to have, well, particular ecclesiastical functions within the Roman Catholic Church, but then he couldn't. And he couldn't also get any money from that because his birth was, or had been, an illegitimate birth. And so that was a really bad start for Erasmus. And so it's a miracle anyway that he got where he finally came to, but it's also something that tells us that his life was not always an easy life. He always was, well, he was always after money, getting money from other people, because he couldn't live from any type of job, because he didn't have any job. Erasmus came from Rotterdam, but he never stayed there anyway. Well, Erasmus traveled around most of his life, which is why nowadays, we don't only have Erasmus things in Rotterdam, but we also have Erasmus things in Europe at large. We have the Erasmus exchange program, for instance, for students. You all know that. And this is because, well, Erasmus was the first one to go around Europe and to study at various places. He started out as a youngster in Gouda, is what we're told, where he didn't have a really very good time. Now, these people are from Gouda, I hear, so I'm sorry to say so, but there is still hope for you. There is still hope for you. Because why didn't he have a very good time at Gouda? That was because he went to school there, and the schools were really, really bad. I mean, the schools, the medieval type of schools, they were just for, I don't know, thrashing little children until they behaved, or until they were so dumb that they didn't do anything anymore, but just sat quietly in their schools. That was the situation in Gouda as well, as we learned from Erasmus. But nowadays, people think that Erasmus actually didn't go to school at Gouda, but in Woerden. So it's not your fault. It's the Woerden people that were so bad to him and that he keeps on complaining about the rest of his life. Where is this picture taken? Anyone? No one? Stein? No. Deventer, of course, it's Deventer. It's the only place really in the Netherlands where you can take this type of medieval picture. I mean, you can pretend that you're in some medieval town. I took it myself, and it is from Deventer, which was at the time, well, the cultural sort of capital of the Netherlands. Why? Well, because it was an important trading city, but also because there was a possibility there to find a different type of schooling, and that was very important for Erasmus. So having left Gouda or Woerden, whatever, he went to Deventer with his mother to study at the new Deventer school that had a new type of educational training that was copied from Italy. We call it now the humanistic type of training. So there was a new trend, there was a new literary fashion there, important from Italy, but it was the only place actually in Northern Europe where you could then have your education in an Italian style. So people learned how to really speak Latin in a classical fashion, not in a medieval fashion, for instance, and how to read the classical Latin authors. And so that was very important for Erasmus' own upbringing as well, but that was not the only thing he learned at Deventer. Deventer was, on the one hand, well, the place where you could get an Italian schooling, but on the other hand, it was also the place where the Devotia Moderna movement was at the time, which was a layman's movement that had sort of ecclesiastical aspirations. It was a movement of citizens who said, we are Christians, but we don't really behave very much like Christians all of the time. Why don't we come to something outside the church that is more comparable to the real thing that Christianity had always meant to be. So in order to become honest citizens that help each other and are just towards each other, etc., we should really train ourselves to deal with each other in new ways, and we do this within our team of the Devotia Moderna, this modern type of devotion that is really more what Christianity is all about than the types of things that you will learn in church. That is also something that happened there's a museum now in Deventer where you can study these things. Also a big influence on Erasmus. And people sometimes say, well, what was the most important for Erasmus? You can't be and a humanist and a Devotia Moderna type of person, but I think you can. In fact, what you see in Erasmus is that he was the ultimate combination of the two. Devotia Moderna on the one hand, and Italian humanist on the other. And he also tried to combine these two things. Well, the rest is not really important. Zettergenbos is just another wooden type of place. It was bad, he hated it, and he hated his education later on as well. In Paris, for instance, and so Zettergenbos is just, well, forget about it. There's lots to tell, but it's not important in any positive way. Is Stein? Where is Stein, anyway? Sorry? Limburg. Yes, that's what people always say. I don't know Stein in Limburg, but apparently there is some place Stein in Limburg. This is not in Limburg. Where is this? It's Haastrecht. Where is Haastrecht? It's close by. It's just a 20-minute ride by car. It's, well, on bike it will be some more, but there used to be a monastery near Haastrecht, which was called the Monastery of Stein. And nowadays there is the, what is it? Museumboerderij het Klooster or something. So they have a place where you can Kaasboerderij het Klooster. Kaasboerderij het Klooster. You have a museum type of farm where you can learn all about making cheese, etc. But what that is called het Klooster because of the monastery that was once there, and they will tell you there as well. Erasmus was once here. It's not too much to tell about Stein either, although there was a good library there, and that was important to Erasmus. But of course, why Stein was also important is what you all came here for, and what was already mentioned in the introduction about Erasmus and his love letters to Servaas. Erasmus was sent by the people that actually sent him there because his parents had meanwhile both died, to the monastery. And Erasmus agreed to go to the monastery. And Erasmus was just a teenager at the time, so he didn't have much of a choice. But when he was there, he enjoyed the books, but he also enjoyed the company of one of his fellow monks. Oh, Servaas, if it were possible, I should have wished you might care for me as I do for you, and that you might feel the pangs of love for me as sharply as I am constantly tortured by my desire for you. I suspect you have not yet become persuaded of my supreme love for you. The wakeful hours are an annoyance. My sleep is stressless. All my food is tasteless when I am deprived of you. Each time I seem to see you in my heart, while tears suddenly burst from my eyes. It wasn't possible, believe me, to write out even this letter without weeping a lot. It will in any case be sweet to be happy, to cry, to live and to die with you. My love for you is, and always has been, so deep, dearest Servaas, that I value you more than my own eyes, my soul, or in a word, myself. For you are ever on my lips and in my heart. You are my only hope, the half of my soul, the consolation of my life. Oh, spare your lover, please. This is Erasmus to Servaas. Now, what does that tell us? Well, just as in the case of, I don't know, Tchaikovsky or Marcel Proust, people have been writing thick books about the fact that this person wasn't a homosexual during the 19th century, during the 20th century. And in Erasmus' case as well, we have these letters. I mean, these are excerpts from various letters, so it's not just one letter or anything. So that must be clear as well. But still, what he writes here is clear, and the letters are love letters, if you ask me. And what people then say is, well, no, they're not love letters. They are, I don't know, exercises in Latin. Okay. Would that ever have been said if this was directed or addressed to some girl? Of course not. So it's interesting that we see Erasmus doing this. And there's another argument. People saying, of course he didn't write love letters because he didn't have to post anything. The guy was in the same monastery. Crazy argument, really. I mean, of course you can write love letters at school. You can write love letters to people who are living in the same house as where you live. And so, yeah, I take them seriously. And I wouldn't want to explain them away. What is nice is that as Erasmus University, we want to be a place where diversity and inclusion is our thing. And so it's good for all of you to know that Erasmus would have joined Erasmus Pride if he would have worked here now. And that he could be our hero in a different way as well. If you want to know more, this was already mentioned in the Voetsporen van Erasmus. If you read Dutch anyway, buy it, I would say, but I've crossed it out here because it's sold out. What do? We'll have to have a new edition. But you might find it still in the second hand or something. The story, this story is also a story of Erasmus going places. It's from Stein to Gouda, Deventer, whatever. But also Paris, Oxford. Louvain was a place that he liked. He really liked London and Oxford and Cambridge. He liked Flanders as well, like Brussels and Ghent and Louvain. But he ended his life, after he'd been through Italy as well. There's mention of Venice in this book. To Switzerland, where he stayed the last parts of his life. Freiburg in Breisgau, also just southern Germany. But Basel was the town where he lived towards the end of his life and where he actually wanted to live. So there's lots of things that we know about Erasmus and Erasmus's private life. But the strange thing is that after the letters to Servaas, we never again meet with the personal type of Erasmus. We meet with Erasmus talking about everything, about politics, about church politics, about the fashions of his day, about anything but not about himself. So that is really typical for Erasmus. And you could also say, well, after his experience in Stein, where he wasn't successful because Servaas didn't react to his letters, and later, when Servaas got to be the man in charge of the monastery, and Erasmus was gone into Europe, Servaas was all the time saying, you are a monk here in our place, come back. And not because of Servaas wanting to make love to Erasmus or anything, no. Because he thought Erasmus was being inobedient by traveling the world as a Augustinian monk, the Augustinian monk that he was. Erasmus didn't want to return, but that is also because he was so active, he was so busy. And that is also something that we could, relate maybe to his experiences in Stein. You could call it a sort of, you could call Freud, and you could call it a type of sublimation. Having experienced that this is not a way to go about in this world, around 1500, Erasmus showed signs of sublimation to the extreme. Erasmus became what we could say the biggest workaholic ever he was working all the time. He produced books. And even though he didn't have a laptop or he didn't have all the time that we spend at the office, he wrote more than any one of you or I ever could write. Or that maybe we all could write together. It's incredible, really. He wrote so much. I call him an educator and an influencer as a sort of what his trademark was for. But that is because he could be an educator and he could be an influencer because of the fact that he was a best-selling author. And so this was in the days when the book publication had just been invented. So, I mean, books in print. And so he had this new medium for getting his ideas across, and he used it also in many different ways. So he wrote books on language and style, for instance, on Latin and on the pronunciation of Latin, and on how to write letters, for instance, and all sorts of things to teach other people how to do the things that he could do himself so well. He wrote books also on manners and on etiquette and on the education of children, because these were actually the days of the Reformation of manners, as we now call them. Around 1,500 people, at least in the towns of Europe, were seeking for new ways to behave themselves towards each other in the way that people behaved at court. And so that's still where we got our word courteous from. A way of courteous behavior towards one another is a way of behaving as if you are living among the nobility. And that is what people wanted to have in the towns of Europe at the time. They wanted not to be these peasants that they'd always been during the Middle Ages. They wanted to behave themselves in different ways. And, well, Erasmus writes books of about etiquette for them. Don't take your dog into the church, eat with knives and forks, wear underwear, new things. And that were all part and parcel of this new sort of behavior. But he did much more. And the things that you see here, adagia and colloquia, are really ways to teach people how to write and how to write and how to read. So in Latin, of course, because this was the way of expressing oneself, reading and writing in such a way that, well, the adagia are collections of proverbs. Proverbs we still use in many different European languages today, in Dutch and in English and in French and in German, everywhere. The fact that we use all these similar proverbs and sayings is because the Greeks and the Romans already used them, on the one hand, but that Erasmus, on the other hand, collected them from the ancient literature for us in order to start using them as well. So Erasmus, well, it began with a book of, 800 sayings, and then later on in his life he kept adding Latin sayings and later on also Greek types of sayings. And then in the end there were, 3,500, I guess. Something like this. Proverb collections. But that, of course, made people, or gave people the opportunity to express themselves in new ways. And that's also true for the colloquia. The colloquia are short stories, funny stories sometimes, mostly funny stories. Stories that were easy to read, but that also gave people the opportunity to start speaking Latin in a more colloquial way, to just have a street type of Latin instead of the old educated types of Latin that were already there. Now, he did much more translations from ancient Greek to Latin, in Latin, of course, or editions of ancient authors, whether Greek or Latin. So in new book form, the old texts that were there in cloisters and in monasteries and in old libraries, to put them into print and then to edit them in such a way that you could rely on the fact that this was the right way of presenting these ancient authors. And amongst these authors, also church fathers, because Erasmus went into the monastery And that's where he became a priest. But the thing that he studied later on in Paris and that he graduated in Turin in Italy was actually theology. So we often think of Erasmus as a philosopher, but he was a theologian. And so he also edits the books of the church fathers, also from the beginning of Christianity, and did many things that were related to the history of the Christian church and to the texts that were important in Christianity. So he also writes commentaries, for instance, on the Bible. And the most important thing for himself, probably, that he did, or at least one of the things that were most remarkable that he did, but that he also found very important himself, was to offer a new translation of the New Testament, in Latin again, from the original Greek. Now that was interesting, because there was a standard edition of the Bible in Latin that was read in church. And Erasmus says, well, that text is corrupt. We should, make corrections to the text. And that, of course, gave him a lot of trouble with church authorities and with other scholars and with the public at large, because people thought, you can't change the word of God. How can that be? And Erasmus says, no, the word of God is there in Greek. You better make a good edition of it, which is a very different way of thinking about the text. But he gave this new tradition of the New Testament in 1516 that also had important consequences for some of the dogmas of Christianity, so that he also got into rows with other people about these dogmas that he never found very interesting in the end, because he didn't like a dogmatic type of religion anyway. All of these books are forgotten. Well, we edit them in Dutch because we're so proud of our Erasmus, but no one reads them anyway. So there's only one little book, which is the Praise of Folly, but which I have put here under the moral works, of which there were many more. The Praise of Folly. Well, yes, the Praise of Folly is a world-famous work. I hear that Silvio Berlusconi says that this is his favorite work of literature, which is a bit strange. But anyway, we associate the Praise of Folly with, humor, of course, and comical things and carnivalesque descriptions of the world, which link up with these types of pictures from the same date. I mean, this picture is a picture from a Flanders tradition, the tradition of Pieter Bruegel and Hieronymus Bos from the same time. We don't know exactly who made it, which is like being funny as well. But the fact is that it was not for being funny. In fact, this is being the other side of courteous. And so this was really a warning against the boorish type of behavior that we had always seen. And a similar thing is, I guess, there in the moral work, the Praise of Folly as well, because it is actually comical. It is actually comical. It is funny. It is funny to a certain extent, this book. Erasmus says he wrote it whilst sitting on the back of a donkey or a horse, traveling from Italy back to London. But that's not entirely true. He just finished it in the next few years in London and then publishing it in 1511. And it's been a famous work ever since. Now, what you find in the Praise of Folly is first, indeed, funny things. Erasmus talks about the Stoic Philosophers, for instance. They're not really human. They are so boring, and they only study all day, and they never have a happy sort of life, and they never have any type of they never have any free time, really. So they never do anything that is agreeable to themselves. Actually, what Erasmus does here is to make fun of himself. He's kidding himself. He's kidding his own way of being a philosopher that is nearly turned into a statue by working all day. But he also talks about having sex, for instance. Can't you see the way in which your own faces are sort of distorted during the deed? That's stupid. But it's, of course, also quite funny in the description itself. Then halfway the book, it gets more sinister. Because after the folly of human failure, Erasmus starts to talk about the folly of what he calls furor, Latin. And in this part of the book, things become more sinister because he's talking about things that are not really funny. I mean, it's still agreeable to the general public because here, finally, you can find some societal criticism on the rest of society. Because what Erasmus is talking about here is the way in which kings and church prelates and all those who are in power or in places of power, because of corruption and greed, turn into violence. And that because of all of the things that are going on in, like the politics around 1500, Europe isn't a very nice place to be. It is war everywhere. And it's for all the wrong reasons. And so although the book isn't funny anymore, it's still somehow agreeable, and the way that it is presented here is by letting Lady Folly, the goddess of folly, you could say, tell us how foolish we are, all of us, to accept all this. And that makes the book rather structured in strange ways, which become even stranger towards the end of the book when he's talking about the folly of faith, where he says, well, the height of folly is really religion and philosophy. Huh? You're talking about religion and philosophy all the time. I mean, how can you now start saying that this is the height of folly? Well, we'll come back to that. We'll come back to that because maybe Erasmus is a different author than we would think if we would only think of him as a comical author or as a modern type of critic on society. Is Erasmus actually really modern at all? That's a good question. In 2020, the Erasmus University published a statement on its website about the fact that Erasmian values are anti-racist values. And of course, that's all very well. But does that actually comply with what Erasmus himself thought and what Erasmus himself presented as his own values? There are people who say, and this is a book that represents this as a new sort of position on Erasmus, as someone not having our values really because he was a racist. He was a Eurocentric. He was someone who had very different values from the values that we have today. Now, let me reassure you, according to me at least, so far as I can see it at the moment, if anyone was not a racist in 1500, it was Desiderius Erasmus. Still, there is a big problem. Because in his works, Erasmus is all the time making fun or really actually being very bad towards Turks, Islamic people, and Jews. And so there's a reason for these people to say, well, look at that, what he says there. Erasmus is an Islamophobe. Erasmus is an anti-Semite. That, of course, is a difficulty, especially in these days. I mean, the University of Edinburgh has just closed down. No, they haven't closed down the building. They've, of course, kept the building. But there was a building which was called the Hume Tower in Edinburgh. Now, David Hume is an 18th century philosopher who advised someone to invest in some plantation in the Americas, and for that reason, he is now being cancelled because he was, promoting the economy of slaves, the slave-based economy. If that is happening today, and of course all around the world, statues are broken, are torn down, what about our Erasmus? What about our university? That's a difficult question. That's a difficult question. So how is it? What does Erasmus say about Turks and Jews? Well, most of the things that Erasmus says about Turks and Jews are really very bad, and they sound bad to our ears. And that is because everyone was saying them at the time. The Turks are violent. The Jews are superstitious, etc., etc., etc. And Erasmus says this in order to get the attention of his readership also. But what you will see in Erasmus is that in the next sentence, he will say, yes, and what about us Christians? And so that is a very different thing that you find in Erasmus as well, that you see that he uses all of this violence, or this verbal violence, as a mirror for Christians, in order to say, look at yourself. Keep up to your own standards. And of course, then it comes, well, to be presented in a very different light. As far as the Turks are concerned, in fact, there is no problem in Erasmus with Turks. He is actually one of the few people who said we shouldn't have crusades and these kinds of things, and we shouldn't even fight the Turks. We should rather be concerned about our own domestic politics. Now, that is very peculiar, because all the time the Christian world was really threatened by the armies of the Turks at that time. So he was presenting this very pacifistic type of ideology towards the Turks, at the same time when everyone was complaining about the great Turkish danger. But the question of the Jews is far more complicated, and it's painful as well. I mean, it's painful for us, living only, a few generations after the biggest crime in history occurred on European ground against Jews. And we see this Erasmus, using swear words against Jews, for instance, or at least what we would see as swear words against Jews. And I would hate myself if I were going to explain this away in order to just save the man that gave his name to our university. At the same time, I don't think that people are really reading Erasmus when they are talking about this, or not too well. And what you see is that with the Jewish theme, there is actually in Erasmus a sort of Christian theme as well. And of course, Erasmus was a Christian theologian for whom the Jewish religion, the Old Testament type of religion, was only a halfway house. And Erasmus says, what Jesus really meant was to make an end to this type of religion in order to have a new type of religion that was not legalistic, not dogmatic, not ritualistic, and not superstitious. So that is something that Erasmus then projects onto the Jewish religion, and that he is all the time criticizing as Jewish aspects of, not only Jews, but Christians as well. That, in fact, is something that doesn't sound very nice to our ears as well, if you use these words, Jewish types of religion. But in Erasmus, this could be just the same problem for Christians. So what he says is, I don't like ritualism, I don't like dogmatism, I don't like superstition, but I don't like them in Christians either. I want people to become real Christians, like Jesus Christ. And what that means is that you have universalistic values that are not dependent on dogma or ritual. And so what he actually says is, well, I invite you all to become this type of Christian. Jews, Turks, blacks, Indians, but Christians as well. And again, you see here that the people addressed by Erasmus are in the first place the Europeans themselves. Please change your idea of Christianity if you want to be Christians in the real sense of the word. Now, that is one thing, but and that explains much, but then you have a different problem in Erasmus. Because there are times that he really starts to scold people for being Jews. Well, that's not very nice. In fact, in the one instance, he's saying of Johannes Pfefferkorn, you are, I don't know, if you cut Johannes Pfefferkorn open, not one, but 600 Jews will jump out. That's not nice either. But then this Johannes Pfefferkorn was a Jewish convert who had changed to Christianity and was now trying to seduce his fellow Christians to take measures against Jews. So in fact, scolding Johannes Pfefferkorn was a way of actually hurting the anti-Semite Pfefferkorn where it hurt most, by calling him a Jew. That's not our way of addressing other people. But it is a way in which Erasmus used whatever he could to attack someone who was attacking others. And the same thing happens with Girolamo Alejandro. Sorry, Giacomo. What's his name? Girolamo Alejandro is a person who Erasmus actually knew from Venice, but who then becomes an inquisitor of the Roman Catholic Church and comes to Flanders to prosecute people because of their Lutheranism. At the time, Erasmus is a Lutheran himself. Oh no, he isn't a Lutheran. He is seen as a Lutheran himself. And he gets scared. And he says, oh my God, what will happen? I will be prosecuted. And so he starts writing against this guy, and he calls him a Jew as well. And he says, you can see you're a Jew. Now, I don't know why he says that. I really don't know why he says that. But again, it is a way of hurting the guy where it hurts most, I imagine, at a time when Erasmus was really afraid for his own life. That doesn't excuse Erasmus for using the wrong words, but it may explain that Erasmus used techniques for polemizing against others that we don't like, but that were used in order, in fact, to fight anti-Semitism. This is also what you find in the letter that is most cited about his anti-Semitism letter to Jacobus van Hoogstraten, where Erasmus says, well, yeah, to be a good Christian, you must hate Jews. But to anyone who really reads the letter, you can see that what he's doing is he's making ironical praise. He's presenting an ironical type of praise for the man who is reading this, who this letter is addressed to, Jacobus van Hoogstraten, who he actually says, shut up. You are now persecuting Jews. What are you doing? And the fact that he uses the things that Van Hoogstraten himself says is exactly Erasmus's way of saying, don't do this, and stop. And this is for me a way of saying we should really research this much more, because there could be a way in which Erasmus, as is said, contributed to an atmosphere of hatred against Jews. But at the same time, if you see what he is doing in practice, it is fighting the anti-Semitism of this Jacobus van Hoogstraten, for instance, a great inquisitor who was the anti-Semite. And so Erasmus could have been an anti-Semite in all of his works all of the time. But we never find it in the rest of his books. And so why? Well, maybe because he wasn't an anti-Semite. If anyone, I say, was not a racist, it was Desiderius Erasmus. But the way in which he presented his universalism as a new type of Christianity was, of course, a way that led to a sort of paradox in the way in which he expressed himself as well. Anyway, so far so good. Well, no, not really very good. We can talk about that much more. But it's the same kind of thing that happens as well if you just take some view from Erasmus's works and present it as if it's Erasmus's opinion. So another thorny example here in Erasmus magazine of the 7th of December 2021. What Erasmus writes here: so a woman will be a woman, a fool, whatever disguise she takes up. That's not very nice either. I mean, this is really misogynic. I mean, this is really saying all women are fools. Is it really? No, it's not. In fact, Erasmus is praising Lady Folly because she is his voice in the Praise of Folly, presenting all of the social criticism that Erasmus wants to get across in such a way that he can have Lady Folly say it. And so, in fact, a woman here is Erasmus' spokesperson. And foolishness is presented as the thing that is really important. There is no time. True. So what I'll do is to just tell you a bit more about what Erasmus then does do in the Praise of Folly. He ends the Praise of Folly with the part on the folly of religion and philosophy. Now, that is something that people never really understand. He's always talking about religion. He's always talking about philosophy. So now, why does he start attacking Plato and Christ? Well, in fact, he doesn't. He doesn't. He says religion and philosophy are types of folly as well because they don't come naturally. They were folly in respect of our natural way of being. They are actually a type of add-ons. We need religion and we need philosophy in order to have a type of software that changes us into a different type of being. We are not born civilized human beings. We develop ourselves into civilized human beings. And so what we need in order to do that is to train ourselves and to use, by educational means, a type of software that will make us into better persons. And that is actually the essence of all religion and the essence of all philosophy, according to Erasmus. So there we end. I would like you to consider whether that then agrees with all the 5 Erasmian values that we have at this university, but we can talk about that later. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for your inspiring and illuminating talk on Erasmus. I can imagine that there are questions. I can't really see you because of the light, so if you have a question, please raise your hand or just scream so I can locate the sound. I don't see anybody yet. Oh, I see anybody. Yeah.
Yeah, I do this. I was just wondering, talking about Erasmus using Jew as an insult, and you didn't know why, but there are some Christians who consider Jews to be the ones who murdered Jesus because they betrayed him and gave him over to the Romans, who then killed him. So in that sense, wouldn't it be the perfect insult towards someone who is basically betraying other Christians by prosecuting them?
Yeah. I mean, that would be a good reason for Erasmus to say that in that particular instance. But then, if he'd been a more civilized type of person, he would just have explained that this guy, Alejandro, was actually damaging Christianity, which he could have explained in different terms. So the sense, I mean, the argument itself, Jews killing Jesus Christ, is of course an important theme in the Christian tradition. But Erasmus doesn't use that as an argument against Jews. No, what he does is he calls someone a Jew. You're a Jew. And that is, I mean, on the one hand, it is of course an easy way to speak about another person in derogatory ways, but this is a very personal attack, and I don't know the right sort of motivation that Erasmus might have had there. Of course, there's a problem with Judaism and Christianity in itself. I mean, if you say that this is the old religion, and now we have the second phase of this religion, which is the better one, it's the question, why don't you change towards the better phase for all Christians towards Jews? And this makes that Erasmus doesn't seem to have any concern for the, I don't know, for the civilizing aspects of the Jewish faith as it is in itself. Acceptance of the message of Jesus Christ is somehow more important, but then at the same time, Erasmus says that that is open to Jews as well, and we shouldn't force anyone to become a Christian. That is also different from all other contemporaries. They would say, well, people should be forced and we should just annihilate their culture, etc. Erasmus says, no. No one should be forced, because that wouldn't be Christian either. So Christianity to Erasmus is something of a way of being just. And that is open to Jews and Turks and everyone, as much as it is open to people who didn't even know Christianity, because Erasmus is the one who said, well, Socrates was a Christian, better Christian than most of us. Is that, I mean, it's one of the aspects, but there's many more different things that Christians bring in against Jews, and have been bringing in as theologians against Jews. But Erasmus isn't in that kind of theological debate, as far as I can see. He doesn't like the Old Testament very much, but then he uses that as well. Even in his book about the Turks, he uses all sorts of wisdom from the Psalms. So he uses the Old Testament also for theological arguments in his polemical works.
And if we reflect that discussion to the recent times, so you were talking about Erasmian values, do you think that this appropriation of Erasmian values, is that an academical integral move towards Erasmus, or is it more a marketing?
Of course, for this university, it's a marketing technique in the sense that you have this name, Erasmus, and then you have all sorts of values that we like world citizen and being compassionate or whatever, connecting, and using that by linking it to the name giver of your university. Now, to me, I would say that there are good reasons for still taking that seriously if you connect it to Erasmus. Because in fact, Erasmus was very much the person who not only thought about education as being very important, but also thought about that all morality is really a way of not being biased against others. And so to overcome your own biases is really the whole message that is there, and that Erasmus calls the core Christian message. So that is also a way of saving Erasmus for these nice values. But then at the same time, Erasmus could be a bad guy as well, because he's from, 500 years ago, and he talks in a different way than we do. And I think that debate should still be had. I mean, there's lots of other people. I mean, Erasmus and Luther were not the best of friends at a certain time. And Luther is the real anti-Semite, but we have a Martin Luther Universität as well, so why don't we have a Erasmus University? But then still, I think to associate Erasmus with the kind of 20th century horrors that we know of is a way of associating him with things that he can't have helped, but that to my mind he neither contributed to. Because we, of course, see talking about others in terms of being psychologically hurtful towards others.
But then maybe making normative standards for now and then is something else.
It's something else. It's our way of thinking about what being non-inclusive really is. Yeah. Whilst Erasmus was being inclusive, even in his paradoxical way of trying to make everyone into a Christian.
Yeah. Are there any other questions from the audience? I see somewhere upstairs there. Wait for the microphone, please.
I've heard the claim a few times connecting Erasmus's teachings as a sort of precursor to Martin Luther. Do you think that's a fair assessment, or was it separate enough to not make such a significant contribution to Martin Luther's works?
Yep. Erasmus laid the egg, and then Luther gave life to it. And yeah, it's true in a way, because Erasmus's criticism on the dogmas of the church were taken up by Luther in a way to criticize the Roman Church. And so Luther takes up everything from Erasmus. But then the reason for Erasmus to do that was to reform this Christianity towards a new type of Christianity that would not be so ritualistic and dogmatic and superstitious. The reason for Luther to do this was to change theology into something new, which is a very different thing. So Luther says, "Oh, Erasmus, you're so superficial. You're just talking about being a good human being. That's not what it's all about. It's about the devil." And that's what we should think about. It's about the things that are going on behind the scenes and the contract between God and Jesus Christ and the way in which we might be saved, whatever we do. It's a whole different story. And so Luther is really the inventor of a new theology. And Erasmus says, we don't need a new theology. We've got the New Testament. It's finished. It's there. It's good. So there's a big difference as well, even though Erasmus takes up all the polemical work of Erasmus in order to use it against the church himself.
Is that an answer to your question? Yes. Well, I might have a question.
There was another one there.
Seriously? Oh, sorry, I didn't see. I'm still wearing my glasses. So.
All right. One more question on the relation between Erasmus and Luther. I understood that Erasmus was put under big pressure to choose sides, and that he didn't want to do that because they agreed a lot on the criticism of the Roman Catholic Church, and that he finally wrote a piece about more a theological theme, and that was the free will. And he is pro the free will, and that was something that hurt Luther in a strong way, and that after that article or book, that then the relationship was getting worse because Luther believed more in the predestination, not in a free will.
Yeah, true.
Can you comment on this?
No. That is certainly so. So, what happened is that, well, the whole world was falling apart, really. I mean, Christianity was falling apart within Europe into a new type of Christianity, which was Protestantism, and the old church, which was also still there. And Erasmus really experienced this as well, because he was living in Basel, for instance, when Basel was taken over by the Calvinists, by the Lutherans, sorry. By the Protestants. And so he fled to Freiburg in Breisgau to be out of the way in a Catholic town from these troubles, later returning to this Protestant town of Basel when there was sort of a peacetime type of cohabitation between Protestants and Catholics. But indeed, he didn't want to leave the Catholic Church. He didn't want to break up Christianity. So he says, at first he says, well, let them criticize the church. So that he did really sort of sympathize with the Lutherans in the sense of people now from another side, another point of view, trying to criticize what was going on in Rome. But then he didn't really like the boorish way in which Luther, for instance, acted, and the way also in which Luther theorized. Because making up this new type of religion, Luther said, oh, well, the Bible is full of sort of things about our behavior, but it's not really meant to make us into better human beings. It's just meant to show us the picture of what we can never be. And then Erasmus says, oh, that's strange. I mean, the Bible is full of things about how to behave yourself. And this is indeed God's way of saying to us how to behave ourselves. And so he points out that the Bible is really full of this, and Luther just denies this and makes his own sort of interpretation and strange interpretations of some of the biblical texts in order to rule out the idea that people would have free will in the sense of being able to develop themselves into better human beings. And so Erasmus really hates that. And so he finds in the theme of the free will a theme with which he can actually tell Luther what he thinks about his so-called theology. And so by doing that, place himself more firmly within the Catholic camp, but not for really linking up to all of the Catholics, because most Catholics are actually saying, well, you are the traitor. You started all of this. And so he falls in between the two camps, really. And that is a bit of a tragic position for Erasmus to be in the end. But it's true that his work on free will is his answer to Luther and his way of saying, calm down and shut up anyway. Because this is always like Erasmus' sort of reaction to others. Don't be such a fanatic. That is what he often says. And he says this to Luther as well. Don't be such a fanatic as if you can really know what God's motives are. We have ideas about that. We have dogmas in the church. But they are also, attempts to really understand. But we don't really understand. We don't even understand free will. We should read the Bible and take the best out of it. And that's all we can do. So Erasmus' whole attitude is psychologically very different from Luther's. But then, it's intellectual, really. It's a sort of elitist reading of the Bible as well. So Erasmus would, in the end, never be as popular as Luther.
All right. How much time do we have?
We can do some more questions, I think.
All right, sure. See a question over there.
Hello. The love letters, if I can call them,
Yes.
are new to me. I find it interesting that somebody has saved them, has kept them. That is already telling, I imagine.
True.
In an era where maybe this was to be to have have open evidence is probably a fragile thing. Makes you vulnerable. In the Catholic Church, with a lot of prosecutions, what do we know about the context where these letters were kept?
I don't know. I should have to get into that. I'm planning to get into that actually, because it is of interest to me myself. But the fact that the letters were kept is indeed for me as well a reason to say, well, if they would just be sort of, I don't know, seminar notes in a Latin class, then probably they would never have been kept. But they were apparently sent to someone who kept them, and then maybe divulged them or showed them to others, or I don't know what happened. But I would have to research that. I don't know. Yeah, interesting question. Indeed, very exceptional. Yeah, very exceptional. But also delicate. And of course, Erasmus published his own letters at times, because he wrote letters all the time. And then he knew they would be published, and everyone in Europe was reading them. But these letters were added later on, because they were found and they were attributed to Erasmus.
Well, quite a while ago, and it might not be fair because we work on the same faculty, our faculty was under pressure. Our faculty would dissolve into a bigger humanities. And I remember sounds coming from faculties, but also other faculties. Well, you can take the Erasmus letters of your university, because without a philosophy faculty, there is no Erasmus University. But that does raise the question, was Erasmus a philosopher in your view?
Yeah, well, there is... that's a good question as well. I mean, Erasmus was not a philosopher in the traditional sense of the word, that he was a sort of Aristotelian scientist, which was the kind of people that were called philosophers, or the logicians or something in his own days. Nor was he a philosopher that he had any type of interpretation of the outside world, or about metaphysical themes such as free will or determinism or anything. So most philosophers would not see Erasmus as a philosopher. I mean, the general public sees Erasmus as a philosopher, although he is a theologian. But he is a philosopher as well, is what I would say. And that is because we normally associate a philosopher with someone who has a place in natural philosophy, or in logic, or in metaphysics, and did a contribution to that, and Erasmus never did. But then we forget about moral philosophy. And in fact, what you see Erasmus do as a theologian is to say, and this is what he says literally, religion and philosophy are actually the same thing. Jesus or Plato, just depends on the words you use. And so he uses a lot of the moral philosophy from ancient times like Stoicism and Epicureanism and Aristotelianism, Platonism, takes out the moral core from there and uses it to present his own, what he calls Philosophia Christi. So my philosophy is the philosophy of Christ, because it's the same thing as what there is in the New Testament. But it's actually exactly the same thing as what was there in the good moral philosophers in ancient times as well. And that is actually also an extra reason for drawing a sharp divide between the kind of philosophers that you have, because this was what people were already saying in Italy. They were saying all cultures are more or less the same. I mean, not everyone said that, but there were people saying whatever the Egyptians wrote, or the Greeks, or the Romans, or we today, there is a core there which is the same for everyone. And then they call this syncretism. And the syncretism is there in Erasmus, in as far as he is concerned with moral philosophy. He says all moralities everywhere are the same. But the syncretism is not there in Erasmus, where these philosophers of his days also said, and all the things that Plato taught us and that the Kabbalah taught us, and that that is there in Pythagoras, and that is there in Aristotle, etc., is all the same. Erasmus says, well, I don't think so.
Right.
But
Han, I see
I'm
Lenya
not interested
getting
either.
angry with us, so I think we have to quit.
That wouldn't be a good idea.
I had one more quick question,
Yes.
hopefully with a quick answer. If people are now totally exhilarated with Erasmus,
Yes.
and you should give them one book or one podcast, what would they listen to or read?
No, they should buy In de Voetsporen van Erasmus. But
Well,
No.
ladies and gentlemen, one warm applause for Han van Ruler, please. Thank you for tonight. I would also like to thank the organization of Studium Generale. Please take a look at their website. They organize a lot of events, and hopefully we'll see you next time. Thank you.